It was the second week of June, 2006, a stretch of dry, heat-hazed mornings in central Arizona. Erin Mayfield had been driving for hours with her 9-year-old son, Caleb, making their way from Flagstaff to a cousin's ranch just north of Tucson. It wasn't a rush trip. Erin had taken the week off work. The back seat held a cooler, a book bag, and 2 small pillows Caleb had insisted on bringing from home. She'd planned the drive around daylight hours, keeping them on the road only until late afternoon. They were halfway through a playlist she'd burned onto a CD when she pulled off at mile marker 212, a weather-beaten rest stop tucked just beyond a bluff of sun-bleached rock and creosote brush. It was the kind of stop most people sped past without thinking. No signage, no vending machines, just a cracked asphalt loop, a row of faded picnic tables, and a cinder-block restroom building with a rusted-out roof vent. The place was quiet, empty except for a single parked semi near the truck lot. Erin pulled into the main lot, parked under a scraggly mesquite for shade, and told Caleb she'd be right back. The air conditioner clicked off. She grabbed her purse from the front seat, left the keys in the ignition, and crossed the lot toward the women's restroom. Caleb unbuckled his seatbelt and started thumbing through a comic book he'd packed for the ride. He remembers watching her walk away, then looking down to read. That was the last time he ever saw his mother. What happened over the next 20 minutes has never been fully explained. According to Caleb, she didn't seem stressed or rushed. She wasn't on the phone. She didn't take her purse into the restroom often, but that morning, she did. He waited. At first, 10 minutes passed without concern. Then he started to feel uncomfortable. It was hot in the car. The air had gone still. He looked out the window again. Still no sign of her. By the 15-minute mark, he started calling her name softly, then louder. Nothing. That's when fear began to creep in. He got out of the car, walked toward the building, but he wouldn't go inside. Something stopped him at the door. He didn't remember exactly what, just that it felt wrong. So he turned around and waited. By the time a passing trucker noticed the boy sitting alone near the car, Caleb was crying, and Erin was already gone. The man tried calming him down, then walked the restroom building, calling out. When no one answered, he called 911 from his CB radio. It was 10:42 a.m. By 11:10, a highway patrol cruiser arrived. Officers searched the women's restroom and the surrounding lot. Both stalls were empty. There was no blood, no broken tiles, no signs of a struggle. Her purse was not recovered, but her phone was later found in the glove compartment. Her wallet, however, was missing. The entire incident had taken place within a roughly 25-minute window on a weekday morning, with no traffic on the lot, no nearby buildings, and no surveillance cameras. By the time search units expanded into the surrounding scrubland, the air temperature had already climbed above 94 degrees. In the official report filed that evening, the incident was labeled as a missing person with suspicious circumstances. Caleb was taken to a nearby ranger substation, where he waited until a relative could drive in from Sedona. The entire time, he kept asking the same thing. She didn't come out. She never came out. What puzzled authorities most in the early hours wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't. No tire tracks, no footprints, no dropped belongings. No witness saw anyone go in after her. No one reported any other vehicle coming or going in that time frame. The trucker had been napping in his cab when they'd arrived, and the only other visitor on the log, a maintenance worker who'd checked the men's side just before 9:45, claimed he hadn't seen anyone at all. For all practical purposes, it was as if Erin had walked into the building and vanished into thin air. Investigators tried to work backward. The night before, Erin and Caleb had stayed in a modest motel just off Route 66. Surveillance footage from that morning confirmed she'd checked out alone with Caleb, paid in cash, and stopped for gas an hour later. Everything until that moment, her route, her mood, her behavior, appeared routine. But the rest stop, now sealed off and surrounded by yellow tape, offered no evidence to explain the abrupt disappearance of a healthy, stable woman traveling with her son in broad daylight. What began as a mother and son road trip was now the epicenter of a missing person investigation, with no clear leads, no witnesses, and no signs of what direction she went, or if she ever truly left the building at all. By noon, the rest stop was no longer empty. Patrol cruisers, a county sheriff's SUV, and a mobile search unit had arrived, engines still ticking in the rising heat. Caleb sat in the back of a deputy's vehicle, clutching a bottle of water, his eyes fixed on the restroom building, as if expecting his mother to walk out any second. But she didn't. Officers moved quickly, splitting into teams. One swept the surrounding area on foot, another taped off the perimeter. A ranger pointed out that beyond the rest stop, there was nothing but flat desert and wind-carved washes for miles. Helicopters were called in by 12:45 p.m. and began a slow grid over the landscape, low enough to stir dust devils from the dry brush. From above, the terrain looked undisturbed. No drag marks, no tire tracks, no path leading anywhere. Inside the women's restroom, things were quiet. 2 stalls, one of them clean and open, the other had been locked earlier that morning. A female officer unlocked it from the outside, using a metal flat key. It swung open, empty. Nothing unusual except for the air. It was slightly warmer inside, like the ventilation hadn't worked. No signs of a struggle. No blood, no shoe prints, no belongings left behind. If Erin had entered that stall, she'd left nothing to prove it. One officer knelt down, checking the gaps beneath the partitions. The floor was dry, the walls clean. There was nothing to suggest this was the last place anyone had ever seen her. Outside, a canine unit arrived. 2 cadaver dogs were deployed. Both circled the area, noses low to the ground, but neither gave an alert. Officers searched the truck parking area, peered into dumpsters, lifted the metal lids on water tanks. Every vehicle in the lot was checked. No sign of Erin, no discarded clothing, no blood droplets. Her purse wasn't found on her, but her wallet hadn't been in the car either. Only her phone remained tucked inside the glove box. There were no recent texts. The last call she'd made had been to her sister the night before, just after dinner, to confirm directions. She'd sounded tired, but normal. When detectives questioned Caleb again, he repeated the same sentence over and over. She didn't come out. She never came out. He was certain she'd gone in, and that was it. He'd watched the door. He remembered it clearly. He'd even walked partway across the lot, but didn't go inside. He was afraid to. Something about it made him freeze. That hesitation would stay with him for years. Later that afternoon, a maintenance worker was located and brought in for questioning. He'd signed into the logbook around 9:40 a.m., confirming he'd checked the men's side and stocked supplies. He hadn't seen Erin. But when asked if anything seemed strange, he mentioned one thing. The women's stall had been locked during his walkthrough, and it stayed locked even after the rest stop was cleared of visitors. He hadn't thought much of it. Occasionally people left the doors locked out of habit. He'd planned to come back later and pop it open. But when he returned, it was already unlocked, still empty. That small detail stuck out. Investigators noted it, but without physical evidence, it meant little. The structure itself was basic. Solid walls, no hidden exits, no loose tiles or false ceilings. News of the disappearance spread quickly. A local affiliate aired the story that evening, describing it as a baffling vanishing at a public rest stop. Online forums lit up with speculation. Some believed she'd been abducted by a passing trucker. Others floated theories of sudden amnesia, voluntary disappearance, or a mental health break. But to those on the ground, none of it made sense. A woman doesn't leave her child behind on a desert highway without her phone, car, or keys. Not in that heat. Not with no trace. By the second day, the case had attracted state attention. More personnel arrived. Drones were flown. Volunteers joined the search, walking shoulder to shoulder through sunburnt terrain, checking old culverts, dry creek beds, and abandoned structures. Psychics called the hotline. So, did self-proclaimed witnesses. None of them offered anything useful. One woman insisted she saw a white SUV speeding away from the rest stop around the time of the disappearance. Another said she thought she'd seen Erin days later at a gas station 200 miles away. But neither story could be verified. What chilled investigators most wasn't the idea that someone had taken her. It was the lack of anything left behind. Usually there was a shoe, a torn piece of fabric, a trail of broken vegetation. But this case offered only a silent stall, a locked door, and a terrified child waiting in a parked car. No suspect, no motive, no body. By the end of the first week, the incident wasn't just a mystery. It was being called a statistical anomaly. A woman disappears from within feet of her child in daylight without anyone seeing a thing. And behind her, the restroom stood empty again, as if it had swallowed her whole. By the end of the first week, the search had expanded far beyond the rest stop. A grid system was mapped out, radiating in widening circles across the high desert, reaching into dry creek beds, ravines, and shallow arroyos. Search teams marked footprints, flagged disturbed brush, logged bone fragments later confirmed to be animal remains. Nothing led back to Erin. Dozens of volunteers arrived with hiking packs and gallon jugs of water, some driving in from out of state after reading about the case online. Temperatures hovered around 100 degrees during the day. At night, they dropped fast. Search dogs were rotated in shifts. Aerial scans were repeated. By day 11, officials had covered nearly 20 square miles without recovering a single item belonging to her. No clothing, no purse, no trace of movement. It was as if she'd stepped off the edge of something no one could see. Tom Mayfield arrived from Reno on day 3. He stepped off a chartered plane, walked into the sheriff's office with his shirt still tucked in from work. His voice cracked during the first press conference. He thanked law enforcement, then criticized their strategy. He believed from the start that his wife had been abducted. He said it calmly, but firmly. He didn't believe she would walk away from Caleb. He pointed to the remoteness of the location, the lack of any working cameras, and the disturbing coincidence of the locked restroom stall. He stood at the lot the next day, staring at the building where she was last seen, hands shaking. But behind the scenes, investigators were already moving in a different direction. A detective in Flagstaff had begun conducting background interviews. Erin's co-workers at the community center where she worked part-time said she'd been acting withdrawn. She'd lost weight, started avoiding lunch meetings, and once broke down crying in her car. A close friend mentioned Erin had recently retained a divorce attorney. Another hinted that she had seemed on edge, though no one could say exactly why. When pressed, one of them admitted Erin had confided she was planning to leave Tom, not just separate, but move out of state. The details were murky. She hadn't said where or when, only that she felt suffocated and needed to get away. These weren't the kinds of statements the public ever heard, but they started to shift the direction of the investigation. Police obtained a warrant for the family's financial records. Nothing stood out immediately. No large withdrawals, no suspicious purchases. But something subtle raised questions. 2 weeks before the trip, Erin had quietly opened a separate checking account under her maiden name. She hadn't used it. There was no money moved into it, but it was there, ready. Her internet history revealed searches for housing in Colorado, legal aid for custody filings, and women's shelters. The possibility that she'd staged her own disappearance couldn't be ruled out. If she had left on her own, she had done it cleanly. No bus tickets, no booked hotels, no recorded border crossings. Still, detectives flagged it. One investigator later said, "It didn't look like an abduction. It looked like a clean break." Until you looked closer, Tom, for his part, denied everything. He told police they'd been working through a difficult year but had no plans to divorce. He said Erin was overwhelmed from work and parenting, but hadn't mentioned leaving. He cooperated with the investigation, submitted to questioning, and provided his travel records. At the time of the disappearance, he was in Reno, clocked in at work with multiple verified witnesses. He passed a voluntary polygraph test. Still, suspicion hovered. Online forums began tearing apart his interviews. Some viewers thought he looked too calm. Others said he was deflecting. A former co-worker of Erin's wrote anonymously that she'd once seen Tom slam a cabinet so hard it splintered. No police reports were ever filed, but the rumor alone fueled dozens of speculative threads online. Weeks passed, search efforts began to shrink, resources were redirected, The story began slipping off the front pages. With no body and no evidence of a crime, the case hovered in limbo. Caleb remained with his aunt. Tom returned to work. The official narrative began to fracture, one part abduction, one part voluntary disappearance, one part psychological breakdown. Police didn't know what they were looking for anymore, a killer, a runaway, or a ghost. And all the while, the desert remained silent, as if it had swallowed her whole. Whatever had happened at that rest stop wasn't giving itself up easily, and every day that passed without a clue made the question more brutal. Had she left to escape, or had someone made her disappear before she had the chance? Over the next several months, the investigation shifted from urgency to endurance. Leads came in, dozens at first, then fewer, each one stretching thinner than the last. State troopers pulled dashcam footage from highway patrol cruisers. DMV records flagged all registered white SUVs within a 50-mile radius. Crime analysts reviewed past cases of abductions at rest stops along western corridors, zeroing in on any involving women traveling alone. But there were no clear patterns, no repeat offenders, nothing that lined up with the vanishing of Erin Mayfield. It had now been over 3 months, and not a single piece of confirmed evidence had been recovered. The grainy CCTV footage from a gas station 2 miles south became a central point of debate. It showed a woman, alone, wearing light jeans and a pale-colored blouse, stepping into the passenger seat of a white SUV around 11:18 a.m. The timestamp placed it within the window of Erin's disappearance. The woman's hair length and build were similar, but the footage was distorted, and her face was never visible. Investigators couldn't confirm whether the woman was barefoot or wearing sandals, and the license plate was unreadable. The gas station's owner told police the cameras had been unreliable for months. One detective described the footage as just close enough to matter, but just vague enough to be meaningless. They re-interviewed Tom Mayfield twice. His alibi remained intact. Multiple co-workers saw him at the office in Reno throughout the day. He had made 2 outgoing calls from his desk phone during the hours of Erin's disappearance, both time-stamped. The polygraph he agreed to was inconclusive, not a fail, but not clean. Authorities noted that emotional shock could affect results. Tom claimed he didn't know about the secret bank account nor the housing searches. He didn't dispute that Erin had been unhappy. He admitted they'd argued, but he insisted he had nothing to do with her vanishing. Law enforcement never named him a suspect, but they also never fully cleared him. Attention briefly turned to long-haul truckers. Rest stops had been linked to criminal behavior in the past, and there were known offenders who had operated along ER-17. They tracked down one man whose rig was parked at the rest stop within an hour of Erin's disappearance. He was located in Texas. The logs from his GPS system were retrieved and matched his route. He had a history of drug possession, but no record of violent offenses. After 2 interviews and a voluntary vehicle search, he was cleared. Another driver recalled seeing a pale blue sedan idling briefly near the exit road that morning, but the description was too vague. No plate, no face, no timing. Meanwhile, Caleb had been placed in the care of Erin's sister in Sedona. He didn't talk much. He stopped asking when his mom was coming back. Sometimes he walked out to the edge of the backyard at dusk and just stood there, facing nothing. He avoided school for weeks. At night, he sometimes woke up crying, saying he saw a white door that wouldn't open. A child psychologist later described him as disassociated, but holding on to something. He never changed his account. She didn't come out, he kept telling people. She went in and didn't come out. Over time, the tone of the investigation began to shift. Detectives started using phrases like self-initiated disappearance, intentional separation, unclear mental state. The original press releases referred to Erin as missing. Later ones described her as unaccounted for. There was no official evidence of a crime. Without a body, prosecutors couldn't open a case. Without a suspect, detectives couldn't move forward. Erin became one of those names buried deep in a binder, tabbed and cataloged, marked with flags, but no answers. The public's attention, once laser-focused, slowly slipped away. News stations stopped running updates. The online forums thinned out. The story no longer held the same urgency without developments. People speculated that she'd run off, started over, maybe joined someone she'd met online. Others were convinced something darker had happened, that she'd been taken by someone who knew how to disappear people. But neither side had proof. It was just noise now, echoing in threads and theories. By the end of the year, the case had effectively stalled. A single detective in Flagstaff was assigned to the file. Every few months, a new tip would come in, someone claiming they saw a woman matching Aaron's description at a bus terminal, a shelter, a women's clinic, but none of it ever panned out. The leads grew colder, and the desert, as always, gave nothing back. Aaron Mayfield was now a photograph, a missing persons poster, and a file number in a drawer that no one had opened in weeks. Whatever had happened that day in June, it had slipped past the edges of visibility, leaving behind only a child's last memory and a silence no one could explain. Time didn't close the case, it only folded it further into silence. After the first year, search efforts stopped. After the third, the media stopped calling. By the fifth year, Aaron Mayfield's disappearance had become one of those cold cases that no one really expected to solve, referenced only in training slides for new detectives, archived in local forums, mentioned occasionally by old highway workers who still remembered the afternoon it all happened. There were no new leads, no breakthroughs. Just a child who had once waited for his mother to come out of a restroom and who eventually stopped waiting out loud. Caleb never went back to school full-time. He was quiet, introverted, and didn't speak much about what happened. He aged out of therapy before it ever seemed to help. By 16, he stopped attending family holidays. By 17, he filed for legal emancipation and left Arizona without telling anyone where he was going. It was the same month his father remarried a woman from out of state. Caleb didn't attend the ceremony. They hadn't spoken in over a year. He took a bus east, changed his phone number, and disappeared into his own kind of silence. What no one knew was that Caleb never truly left the place where it had happened. Not mentally, not emotionally. Every year, like clockwork, he returned to that rest stop off Highway 17, mile marker 212. He would drive in quietly, park in the same lot, and just sit. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes until dusk. The building hadn't been maintained in years. Paint peeled from the walls. One of the restroom doors had warped from heat and wouldn't close properly. Vines grew through cracks in the foundation. The sign for the women's entrance had faded so badly it looked blank. But Caleb came back anyway, like it owed him something. He started documenting the place in notebooks. Weather on certain days, wildlife tracks in the dirt, tire marks in the lot. He would draw floor plans of the building from memory, marking the stall his mother had supposedly entered, the one the maintenance worker said had been locked. At first, it was just notes, but eventually he started researching other disappearances. It began with a post on a message board. Someone had commented that a different woman, a traveler from Colorado, had gone missing near Cortez Junction in 1998. Caleb pulled the file. She had stopped for fuel and was never seen again. Her car was found abandoned outside a rest area 20 miles north of where Aaron disappeared. 2 years later, a teenage girl had vanished near Sunset Point. Her body was never found. Caleb created a spreadsheet, names, dates, GPS coordinates. A pattern started to form. By the time Caleb turned 25, he had a small database, 6 women, all missing within a 50-mile stretch of I-17 between 1995 and 2011. All had vanished at or near unstaffed rest stops or scenic pull-offs. Most were traveling alone. Most were never recovered. Law enforcement hadn't connected them. Different jurisdictions, different counties, different timelines. Some had been written off as voluntary disappearances. Others had been passed between departments until the paper trail blurred. But Caleb saw what he believed others had missed: proximity, patterns, quiet details. He started a blog under a pseudonym, publishing his findings. It didn't attract much attention. A few true crime readers followed along. A podcaster reached out once but didn't follow through. Caleb never revealed who he was or why it mattered to him. He didn't want attention. He wanted to understand. Why his mother? Why there? Why no one had found a single trace? What kind of place could hide a body for 19 years without ever being noticed? In all that time, he never went inside the restroom building again. He would stand outside, hands in his pockets, staring at the cracked door like it might answer him. Sometimes he thought about kicking it open. Other times he thought about burning the whole building down. But mostly, he just stood there, as if waiting for the ground itself to speak. He still remembered exactly how long he'd waited in the car that morning. 23 minutes. Every year, on the same day, he waited 23 minutes in silence. Then he left. Erin's case remained officially unresolved. No one had updated the file in over a decade. The detective originally assigned to her case had since retired. The tip line still existed, but the number had changed. The file sat in a cabinet marked cold, buried beneath more recent tragedies. But for Caleb, the weight of it never changed. The place itself never changed. Something about that rest stop kept calling him back year after year. Not because he expected to find her, but because a part of him had never left. The rest of the world had moved on. But the stall had stayed. And so had the question. In the spring of 2025, a state infrastructure audit quietly listed several defunct roadside facilities for demolition. Among them was the rest stop off Highway 17, mile marker 212, the same place where, nearly 19 years earlier, Erin Mayfield had vanished without a trace. The building had been shuttered for over a decade. Graffiti covered the outer walls. Wind had stripped most of the signage down to warped plastic. Inside, rodents had burrowed nests beneath the cracked tile. The state had long since rerouted highway funds to larger, more monitored facilities. For most people, the old rest stop was an eyesore, forgotten asphalt surrounded by desert. But for one demolition crew, it was something else entirely. On the morning of May 17th, a contracted crew arrived to begin structural prep. Their task was to assess load points before bringing in heavy machinery. The interior was gutted, corroded stalls, rusted sink pipes, insulation half-rotted from time. As they began removing panels from the back walls of the women's restroom, one of the workers noticed something strange. A square of drywall behind the utility sink had been patched over with an entirely different material, metal sheeting screwed into plaster. It wasn't on the original blueprints, and it wasn't like the other panels. At first, they thought it might have been added during plumbing repairs, but when they removed it, they found a hollow cavity no one had expected. Behind the panel was a crawl space, narrow, dark, and filled with old insulation. But wedged against the far end, contorted into a space less than 3 feet high, were what appeared to be human remains. The crew stopped immediately. Authorities were called. Within hours, the site was sealed off, and the cold case file for Erin Mayfield was pulled from storage. DNA confirmation took less than a week. It was her. Erin had never left the building. She had been there the entire time, hidden behind a wall no one thought to look behind, sealed in a crawl space barely wide enough to turn around in. The news spread fast. For years, her case had been used as a cautionary tale, but now it was something else, a reminder that the unthinkable could live just inches from view. Reporters revisited old footage. Archived articles were reposted. People who had followed the case in 2006 returned to the forums, stunned. Some couldn't believe they'd missed it. Others weren't surprised at all. The theories about that locked stall suddenly felt too on the nose to ignore. A detail once dismissed as coincidence had become the story's most damning clue. The forensic team began their work immediately. Erin's skeleton was largely intact. Her clothes deteriorated but identifiable. The crawl space itself appeared to be part of the original structure, but had never been included in the updated building schematics used during the initial investigation. A utility schematic from 1995, long buried in a state archive, showed the wall cavity had once been accessed by maintenance personnel for pipework, though that access point had been sealed over years before her disappearance. Whoever had placed her there had known about it. Knew it was hidden, knew no one would check. Aaron's body showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, fractures near the jawline, no defensive wounds, no ligature marks. There were indications that she had been unconscious before death. Toxicology was inconclusive due to decomposition. The position of the body suggested she had been moved post-mortem, likely folded into the cavity after death, possibly within minutes or hours of her entering the restroom. A small rusted object was found, lodged near her remains, a key ring containing a state-issued utility cabinet key. Detectives returned to the original reports. Among the many interviews from 2006, one stood out again. A part-time janitor on contract through a third-party vendor had been scheduled to clean the facility that week. His name was James Elroy Miller. He had clocked in for his shift 2 days before Aaron disappeared and never returned after that day. At the time, he was considered a minor witness. His logs appeared incomplete, but not suspicious. There was no known criminal record. He was never questioned more than once, but in light of the crawl space and the utility key, he was suddenly no longer background noise. He was a name worth chasing. The local sheriff's office reopened the file. The FBI was consulted due to the interstate nature of the case. Press conferences were held. Tom Mayfield, now remarried and living in Washington State, declined interviews. Caleb, now 28 and living under a different name, issued a short statement through a friend. "I always knew she didn't walk away." He returned to the rest stop one final time, this time to see what had been behind the wall all along. What he saw wasn't closure, but it was an answer. The discovery shifted everything. The case was no longer about a disappearance. It was a confirmed homicide. The narrative had changed. Aaron Mayfield had not left of her own accord. She had not broken down or vanished into the desert. She had been killed, hidden, and left behind a false wall that no one thought to question. And now, 19 years later, her voice was finally coming through, silently from within the walls that had held her all this time. But the question remained: who put her there, and why? The autopsy report was short. 19 years in a sealed space had reduced most physical evidence to bone and dust, but some answers remained. The fracture in Aaron Mayfield's skull was unmistakable. Trauma to the occipital region, deep and deliberate. Forensic pathologists estimated she died instantly. The angle of impact suggested she hadn't seen it coming. There were no defensive wounds, no broken fingers, no bruises to the arms. Her body had been placed, not dragged. There were no signs of panic, no claw marks, no torn clothing. Whatever happened inside that restroom was fast, quiet, and planned. She had been ambushed. The object used to strike her left a distinctive impression, slightly concave with a flattened edge. It matched the weight and curvature of a long-handled toilet spud wrench, standard equipment in janitorial kits for commercial bathrooms. Most were issued by the state and rarely left the facility. Investigators went back to the maintenance logs from 2006. They weren't looking for suspects. They were looking for tools. What they found instead was a name that should have stood out 19 years ago, but didn't. James Elroy Miller, contract janitor, employed through a third-party custodial company that serviced over 24 roadside facilities across Arizona that summer. Miller had signed in on the morning of June 12, 2006, 2 days before Aaron vanished. He was scheduled to return to mile marker 212 on the 14th. He never showed. The company marked it as a no-call, no-show. The contract was terminated within a week, no follow-up, no flag. At the time, it was seen as routine turnover. Janitorial work on remote state contracts paid little and saw high attrition. What no one had noticed was that Miller's last known location placed him inside the same restroom where Aaron was last seen. And no one had looked closely enough to realize he never picked up his final paycheck. A background check revealed minor offenses: trespassing in his early 20s, a misdemeanor charge for unlawful entry into a closed facility in New Mexico. But nothing violent. He had no outstanding warrants, no open cases. At the time, he was just another name on a rotating list of maintenance staff. But now, 2 decades later, with Aaron's body found behind a maintenance wall and the cause of death linked to a janitorial tool, the coincidence turned into something far more chilling. Detectives tracked down the custodial company, long since restructured and rebranded. Old records were buried in archived storage, scanned PDFs of handwritten shift logs. Among them, they found Miller's original application. No listed phone number, no emergency contact. The address he gave was a trailer. Lot outside of Camp Verde, since demolished after a fire in 2011. His social security number was valid, but nothing had been filed under it in years. No employment, no taxes, no address updates. James Elroy Miller had vanished in the same year Aaron had, only no one had noticed. And unlike her, he had done it by choice. The more they looked, the stranger it got. His name had popped up once more in 2007, tied to a traffic ticket in southern Utah, failure to yield. He'd signed the citation, but never paid the fine. Then, the paper trail ended. No fingerprints in national databases, no driver's license renewals, no credit activity, no social media. It was as if he'd stepped out of the system just as neatly as he'd stepped away from the scene. Authorities issued a quiet BOLO, be on the lookout, but privately, investigators admitted they weren't sure if Miller was still alive. And if he was, they had no idea where he'd gone. What disturbed them most wasn't just the timeline, it was the architecture. The crawl space where Aaron had been found wasn't listed in the blueprints. It wasn't on any state renovation plans. Only a single schematic from 1995, predating most digital records, showed a cavity behind the utility wall, built for access during plumbing upgrades, then sealed and forgotten. It wasn't a secret room. It was just overlooked. Something small, buried in paperwork, until someone who knew the space well enough used it to hide a body. If Miller had cleaned that facility even once before, he would have known the crawl space existed. And if he'd been inside with a tool in his hand when Aaron entered alone, then the opportunity had been there all along. The theory that she had walked away or staged her own disappearance collapsed under the weight of the evidence. Aaron hadn't vanished. She had been silenced, hidden in the very building her son waited outside of, just feet away. And the man most likely responsible had been standing there too, unseen. Not a stranger from the highway, not a violent offender flagged in a system, just a quiet worker with keys to the wall, a name buried in a cleaning log, a ghost no one had looked for because no one had known he existed. The case, once dismissed as inexplicable, had become something worse. A reminder that the horror wasn't in how far she had gone, it was in how close she had always been. Under state records, James Elroy Miller barely existed. He had no fixed address, no long-term employment history, and no surviving family willing to speak to law enforcement. He was what some investigators call a floater, a man who passed through towns, picked up short-term work, never stayed long, and left few traces. His file in 2006 was little more than a single-page application submitted to a third-party custodial vendor. A local number, since disconnected. A mailing address at a trailer park in Camp Verde that had burned to the ground in 2011. By the time detectives in 2025 began asking questions, nearly every place tied to his name was gone. But something about him wouldn't let go. When Caleb learned that the man who likely sealed his mother into a wall had never even been flagged as a person of interest, he went quiet for days. He reread the forensic report. He studied every version of the state-issued spud wrench used in 2006. He pulled cleaning schedules, contractor databases, and even the original vendor rosters from archived facility maintenance bids. Then, he asked the question that no one had. How many other women disappeared near rest stops that Miller had access to? The answer was 2. One was 22-year-old Nicole Stenger, last seen near Cordes Lakes in 2003. Her car was found locked near a scenic overlook 20 miles north of mile marker 212. She was on her way to visit friends in Phoenix. She never arrived. Her phone was found months later in a wash. There were no signs of struggle, and her disappearance was ruled unexplained. The second was Diane Maris, 41, traveling alone from California to New Mexico in 2005. Her last cell tower ping came from near Sunset Point. She, too, was never found. Caleb traced both timelines. Both women had gone missing during periods when Miller was contracted in the region. Both locations were within a short drive of facilities maintained by the same custodial company. Neither woman had previously been linked to any suspect. Detectives reopened both cases. They requested old physical evidence, sifted through property reports, re-interviewed family members, and began to cross-reference witness accounts. A truck driver had recalled seeing a man matching Miller's description near the Sunset Point rest stop days before Diane disappeared. Another remembered a confrontation between a janitor and a female traveler over the restroom being closed for cleaning. That traveler was never identified. The reports were vague, nearly 2 decades old and impossible to verify, but they began forming a picture. Not of a man who snapped once, but of someone who had likely done this more than once. The deeper investigators dug, the less they found. Miller used several variations of his name: Jimmy Miller, James Rowland, even Elroy J.M. on one pay stub. He worked under-the-table jobs across 3 states: gas station night shifts, pest control, janitorial work. Each stint lasted weeks, sometimes months. He was quiet, polite, and forgettable. Employers never complained about his work. Co-workers said he was odd, kept to himself, but didn't cause trouble. What no one realized until it was too late was how perfectly that anonymity had served him. His fingerprints were not in national databases. No military records, no driver's license renewals after 2006, no banking activity, no confirmed sightings. One neighbor recalled he used to feed stray dogs behind the trailer park and once helped fix a leaky pipe in her mobile home. That neighbor died in 2014. Another thought he might have left for Nevada, but couldn't say why. Every new path ended in an empty lot or a burned building. Eventually, the investigators were left with a suspect who existed only in fragments: a partial fingerprint, a signature on a janitorial log, a name that no longer connected to anything real. The Arizona Department of Public Safety quietly created a special file for Miller, suspected in connection with 3 disappearances and 1 confirmed homicide. Caleb was given the courtesy of being informed before the public. He didn't react, not outwardly. He spent the night at the same motel his mother had stayed in before she vanished. He walked the route she would have driven that morning. He pulled into the old rest stop again, but this time he entered the building. What remained was barely standing, rusted door hinges, collapsed stalls, sun bleaching the tile. But the wall had been repaired, sealed over again. He touched it briefly, then sat on the floor, notebook in his lap. He didn't write anything. The state did not issue a warrant. They couldn't. Miller was not formally charged, not even officially listed as a fugitive. There was no definitive evidence linking him to Nicole or Diane, no confession, no eyewitness, just proximity, vanishing contracts, and one hidden body. Prosecutors knew it wouldn't hold up in court, but privately, everyone involved agreed. If Miller was still alive, he was running. And if he wasn't, then somewhere in the desert was another unmarked grave. In 2026, a cold case analyst in Nevada flagged a construction job log that included the name J.E. Miller on a 3-week plumbing assignment near Henderson in late 2006. The pay stub matched the same signature from his custodial contract in Arizona. It was the last confirmed record of Miller's whereabouts. After that, nothing. No trace in shelters, no DMV hits, no obituaries. It was as if the man had been swallowed by the same desert he had used to hide his victims. That year, Caleb filed a petition to have Miller declared a wanted person under the unresolved homicide of Aaron Mayfield. It was denied. There wasn't enough evidence, but the investigator assigned to the case did something quietly. He added Miller's name to the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program database, along with a short note, believed to be responsible for at least 1 death, possibly more. Knows how to vanish. The rest stop was permanently decommissioned. The land was scheduled to be returned to the Bureau of Land Management. Caleb requested access before demolition. He brought a small piece of wood with him, the original restroom stall door number where his mother had likely gone. It had been removed by the forensic team and tagged as evidence, then discarded as surplus when the site was closed. He'd found it by accident, labeled with the wrong year. He didn't say what he planned to do with it. He just stood there, holding it in the silence. The story wasn't one that offered closure. It didn't end with an arrest or a trial. There was no confrontation, no justice, just a man who moved like smoke through forgotten places and a pattern of women who went missing where no one was looking. For Caleb, the horror wasn't just in how it ended. It was in how easily it had been allowed to begin. A uniform, a key, a crawl space, and a name so ordinary, so quietly forgettable, that it took 19 years for anyone to ask where he'd gone. Even now, there's no proof Miller is still alive. But there's no proof he isn't. And in the vast silence of the Southwest desert, there are still rest stops, still places with unlit corners, unlocked closets, forgotten doors and crumbling walls, places that look empty but aren't. Caleb doesn't stop at them anymore, but sometimes he drives past slowly, windows down, listening for a sound no one ever recorded. Not the scream, not the door, just the silence that always followed. For years, Caleb had kept to himself, working odd jobs, living under the radar, collecting every loose detail of his mother's case with the quiet precision of someone who'd learned not to trust how quickly the world forgets. But after Aaron's remains were discovered behind that wall, something shifted. He no longer felt like the only one holding the thread. For the first time, the weight of his suspicion had a name: James Elroy Miller. And he wasn't alone in wanting answers anymore. By the summer of 2026, Caleb had started connecting with investigative podcasters, people who specialized in the kind of long-form storytelling that didn't flinch from cold cases. One of them had followed Aaron's disappearance since the early days and had already created a 3-part series after the crawlspace discovery. Another, based out of New Mexico, had covered unsolved highway disappearances and reached out after Caleb posted a data visualization of disappearances along I-17 between 1995 and 2007. What began as cautious emails turned into recorded interviews, cross-referenced timelines, and the sudden emergence of more names. 3 additional women, all reported missing between 2000 and 2005, shared an unsettling pattern. Each had been last seen traveling alone along routes near rest stops or roadside pull-offs. None had been recovered. One had been dismissed as a likely runaway, another as a possible domestic situation, and the third simply filed as missing suspicious circumstances. At the time, none of the cases had received much attention beyond local papers, but when the investigative team overlaid the timelines with custodial records from Miller's employment, it became undeniable. They all vanished within a window when Miller had active state contracts in the region. The cases were reopened. A task force was formed between Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada, aided quietly by the FBI. They began pulling latent evidence files, digging through boxes labeled archived, scanning print photos of parking lots, rest areas, and blurry figures from outdated surveillance systems. One of those boxes, belonging to the 2003 assault case in Alamogordo, New Mexico, included a partial fingerprint recovered from a broken plastic utility box found near a scene where a female traveler had been attacked at night. She survived barely, but the case had gone cold. The print had never matched anyone until now. Forensics teams ran the partial against items recovered from Aaron's crawlspace. One ridge, degraded but visible, produced a probability match, too incomplete for a court, but strong enough for investigators to link Miller to the 2003 assault. The survivor, now living under a new name, was contacted. She recalled only fragments of the attack. She'd pulled off the highway to rest, had used the restroom at an unstaffed facility near a fuel depot. She remembered being hit from behind, waking up hours later under a tree line. She never saw the attacker's face, but she remembered something else. A man in a work shirt who passed by as she exited the building. He had nodded once, looked past her, kept walking. She thought he might have been another traveler, But that was the last face she remembered before the blackout. The connection made headlines in Southwest regional press. Caleb sat with investigators for hours, walking them through his mother's routines, her mood before the trip, the items she packed. He shared his own research, a private map of rest stops overlaid with historical custodial contracts and missing persons reports, color-coded by date. One investigator called it obsessive, another called it thorough, but both admitted that what Caleb had assembled was more comprehensive than anything the state had previously compiled. Still, as the case seemed to be gaining momentum, it suddenly began to stall again. After the Alamogordo match, the leads ran dry. Miller's aliases couldn't be tied to any bank records. His last known address, the burned-down trailer lot, was confirmed to have been abandoned before the fire. No neighbors remembered when exactly he left. DMV records showed no registered vehicle. No family members had ever come forward, and old employment contacts claimed they hadn't heard from him since 2006. Even the Social Security number on his file went cold after that year. No income reported, no benefits applied for, nothing. Law enforcement began quietly exploring the idea that Miller may have died years ago, perhaps in the desert, perhaps under a different name. But they couldn't prove it. There was no death certificate, no remains, no digital footprint of any kind. For Caleb, it was like being handed the name of a ghost, a man who had operated in plain sight, then vanished as if he'd never existed, leaving behind a trail of absences. Not scenes, not blood, just absence, and the empty spaces between the last person seen and the person never found. The podcasts continued. Caleb began receiving messages, dozens at first, then hundreds. Family members of the missing, women who had survived strange encounters at rest areas. One woman wrote that, years earlier, she'd pulled over at a roadside facility outside of Flagstaff and saw a man in coveralls standing near the restroom door, staring into the lot without moving. She got back in her car and drove off. It wasn't evidence, but it wasn't nothing. Another woman said she remembered seeing a man cleaning a rest stop who refused to speak when she greeted him. She said it stayed with her for years because of the way he ignored her. She couldn't remember the date, but it matched Miller's active work window. Investigators logged every message. Most were impossible to verify, but all of them painted the same picture, a silent figure who never stood out, never broke rules, and never left a trace. By early 2027, the task force had nothing left to follow. They issued a new public appeal, asking for anyone with knowledge of Miller's whereabouts to come forward. They received nothing. Not a single credible sighting in over 20 years. Some began to wonder if Miller had changed names, disappeared into a community that wouldn't ask questions. Others feared the alternative, that he was still out there, living under a stolen identity, hiding in plain sight. But for Caleb, a darker possibility had begun to take hold. What if his mother wasn't the first? What if she wasn't the last? What if Miller had kept moving long after 2006 and had simply found another wall? That question kept Caleb awake at night. He updated the map again, now tracking disappearances from Arizona through Utah, Nevada, and parts of eastern California. He filtered the cases for women traveling alone, last seen near unmonitored rest areas. He found 12, all unsolved, all forgotten. But without Miller's face, without DNA, without someone willing to talk, the case remained in limbo, suspended in a space where everyone knew what had likely happened, but no one could prove it. A case that had grown beyond a single victim, beyond a single building, and into a pattern too fragmented to prosecute. In the final episode of a 5-part series, one podcaster described the investigation this way. It's not that the answers aren't there. It's that the man who holds them made sure no one could follow. And that, perhaps, was the most haunting part of it all. Erin Mayfield's body had been found, but the man who took her, and possibly others, had not. The name was known now, the pattern was exposed, but justice, in the truest sense, remained missing. And the deeper they looked, the more it seemed that for every woman lost along that stretch of desert highway, there was only silence in return. The wind moved through the scrub quietly that morning. No search parties, no sirens, no dogs or drones, just one man standing under a crooked mesquite tree, holding a rusted key in his hand. It had been found wedged between what remained of his mother's clothing and the crawlspace wall, small enough to be missed if the forensic team hadn't swept twice. Its teeth were worn down, the ring was bent, but it was unmistakable. It belonged to a state-issued janitor's utility cabinet. Caleb turned it over slowly, like it might still unlock something, but there was nothing left to open. The land around the rest stop had been leveled the week before. After the remains were recovered, after the crime scene had been processed, after the last of the forensic scans had been taken, the state moved forward with demolition. The building was too damaged to repurpose and too notorious to leave standing. So they took it down, brick by brick, tile by tile, until all that remained was a patch of bare dirt and a small pile of crushed cinder block near the highway's edge. Caleb had asked for one thing, that they leave the tree alone. It wasn't part of the original structure. It grew just past the perimeter of the lot, angled against the wind. The same place he had once stood waiting for his mother to come out. He buried her ashes beneath that tree, in a shallow grave lined with stones. There was no marker, no plaque. Just a small folded photo tucked between roots, an old image from the mid-90s, before the divorce papers, before the job changes, before the rest stop. It showed Erin smiling in the passenger seat of a car, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, one hand reaching back to where Caleb sat buckled in his booster seat. She hadn't been missing yet. She hadn't become a name in a file or a theory on a podcast. She had just been someone's mother. No one was ever arrested. The fingerprint found in the crawl space, though linked to a prior assault case, wasn't strong enough to build a prosecution. The suspect, James Elroy Miller, remained classified as unlocated. Officially, he was a missing person with a history of short-term employment and no known next of kin. Unofficially, he was the reason Erin Mayfield's case had moved from missing to homicide. Investigators didn't say much, but one of them later admitted that if Miller wasn't dead, he had done something extraordinary. He had disappeared better than anyone they had ever seen. In the end, what the crawl space revealed wasn't just a crime. It was the shape of something larger, something systemic, built into the spaces people never look. A locked stall no one questioned, a missing maintenance log buried in a forgotten office, a wall cavity never added to the updated schematics. The restroom had never been a place of safety. It had been a trap, hiding in plain sight, and for 19 years, the people responsible for finding Erin had stood within feet of her remains and never known. Caleb didn't try to become an activist. He didn't sue the state. He didn't speak at conferences or release a memoir. Instead, he returned to the map. The same one he'd started when he was 19, color-coded with pins and dates. He expanded it, added new layers, plotted the disappearances of women across every Western corridor between 1998 and 2007. The data didn't form a perfect pattern, but it didn't have to. It was enough that it kept happening in places that looked exactly like the one where Erin had died. Quiet stops, unmonitored stretches, maintenance closets no one ever opened. One case in Nevada had eerie similarities. A 34-year-old woman vanished from a rest area off US 93 in the spring of 2002. She had been traveling alone. Her phone was found in the car. Her body never recovered. Another in Utah involved a woman who pulled over to call for help after her car overheated. Her car was found running, her purse inside, her keys in the ignition. No sign of her. Both sites had been serviced by out-of-state custodial contracts at the time. Records for those contractors no longer existed. Caleb didn't claim they were all connected. He just asked why no one had ever looked. Privately, investigators admitted that without Miller, the cases would likely remain unsolved. They had no forensic trail, no living witnesses, and no motive they could prove. The theories remained: that Miller had died somewhere in the desert under a false name, that he had started over under a different identity, or that he had continued his pattern in a new state and had simply never been caught again. Whatever the truth was, It now lived outside the reach of subpoenas or trials. Caleb understood that, but he still kept the key. Every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, he returned to the tree. He didn't speak. He didn't light candles. He just sat in the dirt for 23 minutes, the exact amount of time he'd waited in the car that day before someone finally asked where his mother was. It didn't make the pain smaller. It didn't make the past easier. But it kept the timeline honest. It reminded him that the silence hadn't come from nowhere, that it had a beginning, that it was measured. Eventually, the podcasts stopped covering the story. The online threads slowed. The case became a reference point, used in trainings, cited in law enforcement literature about missed evidence, overlooked maintenance structures, and the vulnerabilities of isolated public facilities. But for those who had followed it from the start, it remained one of the most unsettling disappearances in recent history. Not because of where she was found, but because of how long she'd been there, how close everyone had been to the truth, and how utterly invisible it had remained. By the end, there was no courtroom, no confession, no justice, just a crawl space, a name, and a rusted key that didn't open anything anymore. But what the restroom revealed was never just a body. It was a pattern, a blind spot in the system, and a reminder that the most terrifying part of a story isn't always how far someone goes before they vanish, but how close they still are when no one sees them.